Hi, and welcome to the Conservation Lecture Series at the National Conservation Training Center. We're still doing this virtually, but hope to, in the not too distant future, go back to doing this in person and virtually, kind of a hybrid model. By the way, we're celebrating our 25th year of NCTC and this lecture series, one of the longest running conservation lecture series out there. And we have a real treat for you today. Finis Dunaway is going to talk about defending the Arctic Refuge, a photographer, an Indigenous Nation, and a fight for environmental justice. I recently read the book. It's a wonderful read. It's going to be a great presentation. I think you're going to enjoy it. But before I turn you over to him, let me introduce him just a little and give a little of his background. Finis is a professor of history at Trent University. He's author of Natural Visions, The Power of Images in American Environmental Reform, and also the book Seeing Green, The Use and Abuse of American Environmental Images. Seeing Green received the John Cowelty Award from Popular Culture Association and the American Culture Association and the History Division Book Award. It's a great book. His writings also have appeared in American Quarterly, Environmental History, and other scholarly journals, including every so often I see him in my local paper, the Washington Post. He's a great environmental historian, a wonderful presenter and writer, and I think you're going to really enjoy this presentation. So let me turn it over to Finis.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the invitation, and to Melissa and Doug and Randy and Rob and everyone working behind the scenes today. I'm joining you from my home in Peterborough, Ontario, which is on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, and I teach courses in history, environmental studies, and media studies at Trent University. I'm really excited to share the story with everyone who's gathered here, and thank you for this opportunity. So if we can go to the first slide. Yeah, perfect. I want to begin by describing how I got interested in this topic and then tell you about the research journey that eventually led to the book. Actually, you can go back just for a second and we'll move on. Let me just say from the outset that this is not the book that I set out to write. It emerged from years of research in libraries and archives and other places, but also from listening and learning, from talking with Indigenous leaders, scientists, environmental activists, and many others across the continent who have been involved in this struggle over the years. I'm very grateful to them for sharing their stories and knowledge with me and for helping me to understand this history differently. So my interest in the Arctic was initially sparked by a photograph. I never will forget the first time I saw this image. It was the summer of 2005, and I was visiting family in Seattle and doing some research at the University of Washington. And one afternoon, as I was about to leave the library, this picture stopped me dead in my tracks. I think it was the colors that first drew me in. You see the orange land, the luminescent waters that lead to the sky beyond. And then as I looked more closely, what really struck me were all those white birds, flocks of snow geese coalescing as waves and undulations that seemed to ripple toward the horizon. The photograph appeared on a poster advertising a show about the Arctic Refuge. And here is actually a faded version of that poster that's now hanging on my office wall. You might see it above my shoulder behind me. The exhibition featured photographs by someone I'd never heard of before, Shubhankar Banerjee. I rushed back to a library computer, and from a quick Google search, I learned that Banerjee's photos had originally been exhibited 2 years earlier, in 2003, at the Smithsonian, where they triggered a major controversy. This was during the George W. Bush years, when there was an aggressive push to drill in the Arctic Refuge. So I went to the show and I found myself mesmerized by the images, including this one of pregnant caribou that are migrating over the frozen Colleen River in Alaska on their way to the calving grounds of the Arctic Refuge. As well as I was interested in how Banerjee depicted the Arctic Refuge as interconnected with Indigenous communities. As you can see here in this photograph of Charlie Swaney taken at his hunting camp just outside of his village of Arctic Village, Alaska. I ended up going to see the show a couple more times before I left Seattle. But after returning home, I wrote an essay about it. But at the time, I didn't think I was ever going to research or write about the Arctic again. As Mark mentioned, I spent the next decade after that writing a book called Seeing Green, which focuses on iconic images of environmentalism. But something led me back to the Arctic. Before diving into the story that I tell in the book, though, I want to first show us a map just to help get us oriented to this region. It may be far away from where many people watching this broadcast live. As you can see, this map was created by the Gwich'in Steering Committee, which is an advocacy group led by Gwich'in in Alaska and Canada. At first glance, this might look like any other map. You see a dotted line running down the middle to mark the international border between the United States and Canada. But as I will explain, arbitrary political boundaries are this map's least important feature. So what we're looking at here is a portion of Alaska as well as the Yukon and Northwest Territories. And the gray shaded area that you see on the Alaska side is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It was originally set aside in 1960 to be managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was known at the time as the Arctic National Wildlife Range. 20 years later, the area was doubled in size and renamed Refuge. The 1980 law granted permanent wilderness status to much of the Arctic Refuge, but it left the coastal plain, that's the red shaded area that you see at the top, in legislative limbo, meaning that its eventual fate would be decided by Congress, which could either extend wilderness protection or allow oil development there. So when you hear about the Arctic Refuge controversy, much of it is focused on that strip of land along the Beaufort Sea, known as the coastal plain. Since the 1980s, oil companies, the state of Alaska, powerful politicians have all pushed to drill in the refuge, while environmental and indigenous advocates have struggled to protect this ecosystem from fossil fuel development. Speaking of which, I should also point out those red dots to the west of the coastal plain. Those represent the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, which feed oil into the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. But I really want to direct your attention to those two curvy lines that loop around much of the map's area, because they tell this map's true story. The darker line traces the transboundary range of the porcupine caribou herd, which it's given its name by the Porcupine River, which the herd crosses back and forth each year on its annual migration routes. This herd, which currently numbers about 200,000 animals, has its wintering range in the mountains and boreal forests of Canada and Alaska. And the caribou migrate every spring to the Arctic coastal plain to have their young. This land provides what they need during a critical phase of their life cycle: sustenance and relative safety. So caribou mothers forage here on the coastal plain, gaining strength from the nutrient-rich vegetation. And their bodies then convert that plant energy into milk for their nursing calves, which you can see here. Meanwhile, there's cool breezes that are blowing off the Beaufort Sea that help reduce insect harassment, and fewer predators live here than in the higher elevations to the south, where their predators would much more likely prey on the caribou young. Not just caribou, but many other wildlife species depend on the refuge, including polar bears, which have their denning sites here, as well as over 200 species of migratory birds that migrate from all across North America and also from many places around the world, including this buff-breasted sandpiper that migrates from Argentina. So in this way, we can think about the Arctic Refuge as something that has significance far beyond the boundaries of northeastern Alaska. It's a place of transnational and global significance. Finally, and most importantly, I think, this map demonstrates the striking overlap between the porcupine caribou herd, again, that's indicated by the darker line, and the homeland of the Gwich'in, which is indicated by the lighter line. So these two lines repeatedly intersect. It's almost like they are mirroring one another, showing the interconnections between indigenous communities and the caribou. So the map is making a cartographic argument for how indigenous communities are tied to, dependent upon, and have cared for this species of animal. For the Gwich'in, the fight against Arctic drilling is a struggle that's infused with existential meaning, to hold on to their identities and cultural traditions, to maintain their relations of responsibility with caribou and the land. So now that we're oriented to the region, let me now continue on the research journey that led to this book. So in 2014, I began reading more about the Arctic Refuge, thinking that maybe I would try to write a book about this topic at some point. And early in the research, I came across a brief article about Lenny Combe, who is a photographer who traveled around the U.S. presenting an Arctic Refuge slideshow called The Last Great Wilderness. I was intrigued by his story, in part because I had written about visual culture before, and I thought it was interesting to think about images circulating at the grassroots. What kind of impact and agency did they have in the world? So I decided I would write Combe a letter to see if I could interview him. This was in August of 2014. I put the note aside for a while, I wanted to do a little more research and reading before I approached him, and then finally completed the letter in October. And before hitting send, I Googled his name one more time just to make sure I had the right email address. And the first link to appear was his obituary. Lenny Combe had died at his home in Todd, North Carolina on September 25th, 2014. He was 74. I was stunned to read this news, and the next day I ended up talking to a friend of his for about an hour. Near the end of our conversation, he offhandedly mentioned to me that he was giving the eulogy at Lenny's memorial on Saturday, and he said it would be great if you could make it down for the service. I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't know if it would be appropriate for me to attend the service for someone I'd never met before. He understood my concerns, but he encouraged me to come anyway. He said this was not going to be a somber occasion. It was going to be a celebration of Lenny's life. And just before saying goodbye, he insisted Lenny would want you to be there. So I went to his memorial, which was held in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And when I got there, I could see that the room was decorated with some of his most treasured possessions, including the 2 slideshow projectors he carried with him as he crisscrossed the country, as well as a beaded floral pattern caribou skin vest given to him by indigenous people from the North. I listened to people talk and share memories of Lenny Combe at the service, and the talk that really left the biggest mark on me was by Lucy Beach, who was speaking on behalf of the Indigenous Nation. She had traveled down from Alaska to be there. She said that all of our hearts are heavy for our brother, our uncle, our grandpa. She talked about the deep connection Lenny formed with Gwich'in communities. She praised his photographs of her people. Beach was one of approximately 50 Gwich'in representatives who had joined Lenny on slideshow tours over the years. She talked about some of her experiences on the road, and she emphasized he let us be our own spokespeople. He never told us what to say. And then she announced, if it wasn't for Lenny, I really think there would be drilling in the Arctic Refuge right now. At the potluck dinner that followed, several people repeated this claim to me. They said, without Lenny and the Last Great Wilderness slideshow, there would be oil drilling in the refuge now. Now, I must confess, I felt skeptical hearing these claims, thinking that this must be exaggeration. And I say this in the book, who among us has not engaged in hyperbole at a funeral? But the questions still gnawed at me. I kept wondering, Could Lenny's low-budget tours really have made that much of a difference in such a high-profile environmental debate? Could a traveling slideshow have protected the Arctic Refuge? So when I left the memorial, I had no idea that I was going to spend the next 5 years chasing down sources, talking with people across the continent about Lenny's activism. I'd come to North Carolina thinking that I might write a chapter about him, that the slideshow would be a case study in a broader history of Arctic activism. For reasons that I cannot fully explain, I found myself becoming fascinated and ultimately obsessed with this story. It all happened gradually. Like any historian, I started going to libraries and archives. I was pouring through boxes and files, looking for any materials about Arctic Refuge campaigns. And whenever I stumbled across a stray document that referenced the last great wilderness, I could feel my heart rate quicken. The paper trail was very elusive. There were a few letters here, the occasional tour itinerary there. Here's one example of a tour from 1995. So I spent hours that sometimes turned into days in the offices and storage rooms of environmental and indigenous organizations. I went to the homes of activists where I looked through files and boxes that were tucked away in garages and basements. I combed through newspapers, especially smaller market, local papers, to gather coverage of last great wilderness tours. I spoke with Gwich'in representatives who went on slideshow tours with Lenny, with grassroots organizers who helped plan and promote the show in their communities, and with lobbyists and other staff members of DC-based environmental groups who helped coordinate his tours. I was searching for any clues that could help me understand the strange career of Lenny Combe. For a year, I tried to track down a physical copy of the last great wilderness slideshow. I have to admit here, I began to despair that I was never going to find it. I knew that his massive collection of slides was being kept at a friend's house outside of Boone, North Carolina, where he'd lived the last 25 years of his life. But nobody knew whether this original show, which had not only slides, but also a soundtrack with music and narration, was still intact and available anywhere. The following summer, I was doing some research in Fairbanks, Alaska, and on the far corner of a bookshelf in the office of the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, a small grassroots environmental group that focuses on Northern Alaskan issues, I spotted a binder tucked away on a bookshelf. And it said on it, LGW slideshow. So I opened up the binder and I found it was filled with plastic storage sheets containing slides from the show. And I began to learn from all of this that the Northern Center had sponsored many activists on slideshow tours using a duplicate copy of The Last Great Wilderness, the same show that Lenny Combe was showing for about 20 years. I also learned that a local volunteer in Fairbanks was planning at some point to digitize all these slides, but several slides were missing from the binder, and it was unclear whether anyone in Fairbanks had a copy of the music and narration that accompanied the show. Then I turned to the final sheet of the binder, and I found a slide listing the show's credits. I put it up on a light box, and I took down the name of Richard Dale, who was credited with producing the soundtrack. When I contacted him, I was ecstatic to learn not only that he had another copy of the slides. It turned out there were 3 sets of the last great wilderness show that had been produced, but also that he had recently digitized the full show, not only the slides, but also the soundtrack. And when I visited him in California a few months later, he gave me a digital copy of the show that I had been searching for. As I began to piece together this story, I came to see the last great wilderness, which was a source that I thought could easily be lost to history, as something more, as a remarkable experiment in grassroots activism and citizen democracy. And I want us to think about this slideshow in relation to how we consider the power and impact of other forms of visual culture. We tend to think that images have the most power when they are seen by the most people. It seems kind of an obvious point to make. Singular iconic images like this one that many of you have seen before, Dorothea Lange's Depression-era photograph, Migrant Mother, or take something like NASA's blue marble picture of the whole Earth. These pictures are routinely celebrated for their capacity to crystallize a cultural moment, to shape public consciousness, even, some would say, alter the course of history. Now, in contrast to these images, Lenny's photographs never became iconic. So this story invites us to think about the impact of images that didn't circulate in the mass media, but rather were shared in unassuming venues, university lecture halls, public libraries, church basements. And this is from a slideshow presentation at the University of Michigan in 1991. So the more I researched this story, the more I realized that this little slideshow left its mark on the broader sweep of the Arctic Refuge struggle. And I began to see how this story can help us understand how a traditional wilderness battle changed into a fight for environmental justice. And some of the big themes that recur throughout the story that I tell are of the role of unlikely activists, the making of diverse alliances, and the power of grassroots visual culture to build a social movement. And I think all these factors have been absolutely crucial to the protection of this land. So you might be wondering, who is Lenny Combe? Well, he was quite a character, as you can see here in this photo with his red long johns up in the Arctic and floppy blue hat. Lenny was born in Seattle in 1939, grew up in a Jewish community, and became a drummer. He studied at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, and then was a jazz drummer for about 15 years after that. He lived in the San Francisco area for a while. He played for a group called the Cleveland Wrecking Company, which was a jazz rock fusion band that opened for the Dead and CCR and Jefferson Airplane and other Bay Area icons. But in 1977, Lenny Combe came to an important realization. He determined that he was, quote, probably the 238th best drummer in the world. And I really like that tongue-in-cheek quantitative precision, probably the 238th best drummer in the world. So he decided to abandon his percussion career and he moved to Sonoma, California. He walked into a drugstore and, in his words, conned his way into running the photo department. So he would develop the slides that customers dropped off. And he said from that experience, he learned about photography and dealing with people and their snapshots. And he began to take up photography himself and dabble in photojournalism. In 1987, as the Reagan administration pushed to develop the refuge, Lenny journeyed north. He was on a speculative assignment for Audubon magazine. And on this trip, he visited the refuge as well as two Gwich'in communities, Arctic Village, Alaska, and over the border in Old Crow, Yukon. And he came there hoping that he could sell photographs to Audubon. He knew that they were going to be running a special issue about the Arctic Refuge, and he hoped he could take some good pictures that he could then sell. But his time in Gwich'in communities completely changed his life. And he began to understand from the Gwich'in how this was not simply a question of wilderness versus oil. They told him that the drilling plan represented a form of colonial violence that threatened their culture and the caribou that migrate through their lands. They told him that fossil fuel development would mean cultural genocide. Lenny returned to California and he immediately threw himself into anti-drilling activism. Along with some friends, they formed a small group called the Sonoma Coalition for the Arctic Refuge. And their goal was very modest at first. All they wanted to do was to convince their member of Congress to vote against oil drilling. And from there, it evolved into a much bigger project, this multimedia slideshow, The Last Great Wilderness, that became their main outreach tool. So refuge defenders in Sonoma and elsewhere knew that they were up against some deep-pocketed adversaries. I mean, we're talking about the fossil fuel industry and some other, very powerful groups. So they adopted what some of the activists called the trickle-up theory of politics. And I have to say, I really quite like this phrase. According to this theory, activists sought to bring local grassroots attention to the Arctic Refuge in communities all across the US. And in turn, they believed that local media coverage and citizen concern expressed in letters to the editor or letters to their members of Congress would then trickle up to national media outlets and to policymakers in DC. So even as they're trying to influence federal policy, refuge defenders believed that the true source of power resided outside the Beltway. And this trickle-up theory really, I think, captures the approach of the Sonoma Coalition, which, as I said, began as an effort to influence their member of Congress before it turned into something much more. So in 1988, Lenny returned for his second trip up to the north. Maybe he was wearing his red long johns again. He spent 4 months in Gwich'in communities in Alaska, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. He was there to take photographs for the slideshow and to learn from the Gwich'in about their lives on the land. Unlike many white photographers who have depicted Indigenous peoples, he did not come to Gwich'in lands as a salvage ethnographer. He was not there to document a culture that he believed was doomed to extinction. He was invited by Norma Cassie and other leaders to visit their communities. He wanted to connect with the Indigenous peoples and grasp our stories, Norma explained to me. He went right directly to our camps, and he lived with us on the land, and he ate caribou up with us, and he helped us make dry meat. He wanted to feel that. He embraced our Indigenous knowledge as much as he could. And this is one of his photographs from along the Porcupine River near Old Crow, Yukon. We're looking at caribou that's in a portable smokehouse. So Lenny's photographs were made with the cooperation of Indigenous communities, and he hoped that they would help play an active role in helping the Gwich'in fight for a future of their own. So he began this 4-month journey in 1988 in Gwich'in country in Crow Flats, which is a vast wetland complex north of Old Crow, Yukon. He stayed with Norma Cassie and her family at their hunting camp in Crow Flats. And this is a photograph that he took there. You can see the large canvas wall tent where Norma's family stayed and the little recreational tent that Lenny pitched there just beyond. These experiences allowed him to see firsthand how Gwich'in lives, culture, and food security were all tied to the transboundary porcupine caribou herd. While there, Norma's mother started calling Lenny the little white man who never sleeps. He was fairly short in size, so it was an apt description for that reason, but also because he seemed to be always roaming around, relishing the long hours of Arctic sunlight and taking rolls and rolls of pictures. As he wandered around the bush, her mom would tease him, calling him the little white man who never sleeps and saying to him, "Bear might kill you." She used to talk to him like that, Norma told me, and he'd look at me funny and we'd bust out laughing. Finally, I told her in Gwich'in, we'd need those pictures because we're going to show them to everybody outside in the world. So when Lenny returned to California in the fall of 1988, he and other Sonoma Coalition members put together the slideshow. They began by gathering pictures taken by many different Arctic photographers. So they were sort of curating these for the show, a few thousand in all, which they then winnowed down to about 250 images. These include several pictures that were taken by Wilbur Mills, who was one of the first photographers to visit what was then called the Arctic Range in the 60s and 70s. He had come there at the invitation of the first manager of the range, Averell Thayer, who wanted to create a visual archive of this area, as well as a photograph by Fran Maurer, a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of an incredible aggregation of caribou. So Sonoma Coalition members adopted what they considered to be cutting-edge technology. They took 2 slide projectors along with a device called a fade dissolve unit, and that was cued to a soundtrack. And by using the fade dissolve unit, they could create a sense of movement between the slides. So viewers would see one slide gradually fade out as the slide from another projector gradually fades in. And at times there's these kind of visual mysteries they're created as the images are superimposed on one another. And I'll show you an example of that later. There's a lot that I could say about the slideshow itself, but I'll keep this part very brief. I have created a website that includes the full digitized version of the show. So if you're interested, you can check that out sometime. Now, I know you're probably thinking, a slideshow produced by amateur activists in Sonoma, California in 1988, how bad is it? Well, I admit my expectations were not exactly high when I first watched it, but much to my surprise, the show offers a complex portrait of the region and I think even fashions an alternative vision of environmentalism. And so I became, after watching the show many times, more and more impressed by the way they layered so many different issues in a short 30-minute presentation. The show begins with the simple evocation of nature scenes, but then it becomes more and more complex and wide-ranging. It emphasizes wilderness values and wildlife protection, but it also portrays oil development on the North Slope, including photos of the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, including these taken by Pamela A. Miller. It then discusses fossil fuel dependency and global warming and the need to transition to a more sustainable energy system. And this is in 1988. This is before Bill McKibben had published The End of Nature, the first popular book on climate change. And they were already bringing that into their discussion of the Arctic Refuge debate. Finally, the show ends by going to Gwich'in country and presenting the refuge struggle as a fight for indigenous rights and for environmental justice. And so during this segment, all of the photos were taken by Lenny, including this series from a caribou hunt. The screen is filled with a picture of 2 caribou in the distance. They're standing before a spruce forest. They're returning the gaze of the photographer as well as the hunter. And the next slide shows a man toting a rifle. Next slide, please. And then after that, audiences see him skinning and butchering our carcass. Next slide. If you think about traditional wildlife and conservation imagery, caribou would appear as creatures to see, but not to kill. They would be seen as spectacles for the eye, not as sustenance for the human body. But this slideshow was not a traditional conservation show. This series of photographs shows us what human rights look like: the right to access food, the right to continue subsistence activities, the right of the Gwich'in to sustain their multi-millennial relationships with the caribou. And so the show ends with a photograph of 2 pairs of boys. You see here their arms draped around one another. They're beaming with irrepressible glee as they run along a road in Old Crow. And then it dissolves into the show's final slide. And here you can see the fade dissolve feature at work here, these kind of superimposed images between that are created by the fade dissolve unit. Into the final slide, which shows 2 clusters of bulls walking with apparent purpose over this frozen ground. And so together, these slides fuse the human story with the caribou story, the fate of the Gwich'in with the fate of the Arctic Refuge. For Gwich'in spokespeople who went on tour with Lenny, his photographs could sometimes have very profound personal meaning, especially when they would see their loved ones in the pictures. Lorraine Nitro described to me what she remembers when she saw this photograph. It was 1999. It was the first time she'd ever given a talk with Lenny. She was somewhere in the Midwest, and there were, she said, a few hundred people gathered in the audience. She didn't know what to expect. She was trying to be brave and strong and thinking, how was I going to go about it? Then she said, I saw a picture of my son and his friends. They were happy, and they had their arms all around each other. They had teeth missing and just were smiling. By the time it was my time to speak, I just felt there was a reason I was there. One day, she said to this audience, I hope to be blessed with grandchildren. I'm doing this because it's my responsibility that they can continue to have our way of life. The very way of life for my people is in your hands, in your decision makers' hands. In the summer of 2016, I showed the Gwich'in segment of The Last Great Wilderness to Norma Cassie, who had hosted Lenny at her hunting camp back in 1988. She had not seen the show in about 20 years, and she was excited to see the pictures again. As the images flashed across my laptop screen, Norma mentioned the names of people she recognized, including her sister. And then when I asked her what she thought of his photographs, it didn't take her long to respond. It was, I think, for me, an intelligent approach to embrace how important the people were and how connected we were to the caribou. He was very much a part of us, she said. He listened and he engaged in a very respectful way. Many photographers had visited Old Crow before, but Norma believed that Lenny's work was distinctive. That was the first portrayal of the Gwich'in, how intricate our way of life was and is as Arctic peoples. And it's really important, I think, to emphasize here that until the Sonoma Coalition came along, national environmental groups rarely emphasized the human rights issues at stake, let alone partnered with the Gwich'in in their refuge campaigns. And so Lenny and the Sonoma Coalition's little slideshow helped change that. They put together the show a few months after the Gwich'in held a major gathering in Arctic Village, Alaska, a gathering that brought together Gwich'in from communities across northeastern Alaska and northwestern Canada. And at this gathering, Gwich'in leaders issued a statement calling for permanent protection of the Arctic coastal plain as wilderness. And they also formed the Gwich'in Steering Committee as an advocacy group to represent their fight to protect the caribou calving grounds. Gwich'in leaders allied with environmentalists, but on their terms. We're not fighting because that place looks beautiful, Sarah James said. We're fighting because our way of life depends on the land. In order for it to take care of us, we have to take care of the land in return. So the Gwich'in completely reframed the Arctic Refuge debate. They presented this place not as a remote, faraway wilderness, but as part of their ecological homeland. Many Gwich'in I interviewed emphasized how important Lenny was to building trust and alliances. Faith Gimmel, an Alaska Gwich'in, said that when she first saw Lenny present the slideshow in DC, she said, I was crying. I was so homesick for my people, just seeing them on the screen and hearing their voices. I started crying because I was homesick, and he knew it. So he came right up to me after, and we just hung out, and he made me laugh, made me feel better, you know? He was like that. Not all the greenies were like Lenny, she said. He made me feel comfortable. He saw me as a human being, not as an exotic indigenous person from the north. He treated me like that, and he made me feel comfortable right away. We were close from then on. Faith also emphasized the challenges of alliance building, noting advice a Gwich'in elder had once given her about environmentalists. He said, we'll work with them, we'll have respect for each other, but in the ultimate end, we might end up standing alone. So I always remember that, she said, because they're not invested. They don't live here. It's not their children that will be impacted. So for them, they could walk away tomorrow and jump on some other issue and leave us hanging. She said that Lenny, among others, was one of the key environmentalists who helped build strong ties with the Gwich'in. And she said people like Lenny were important because they were like a linchpin. They kept us connected. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, Lenny was sponsored by environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Alaska Wilderness League. They consider the slideshow critical to the Arctic campaign. And this belief was also shared by Indigenous leaders. Gwich'in governments and other organizations work closely with Lenny to ensure Indigenous participation in the tours. So in his early years, Lenny drove around in this metallic green Chevy Malibu Classic all around the country. He had his bumper stickers on there announcing the true purpose of the tour, help preserve the Arctic Refuge, America's last great wilderness. He filled the back seat with everything he needed for the show, and this is obviously a pre-PowerPoint time. So this involved slide projectors and carousel trays and sound system and speakers and all kinds of cables and wires and cords. And he carried these in 2 custom-built wooden crates. One of them had wheels, so he could stack the hefty boxes on top of one another and roll everything to the next show. In the book, I describe many tense moments, times when it seemed that the outcome could go either way. The narrative sometimes hinges on these moments, on the relatively narrow time scale of recent political history. But I also try to include some longer-term perspective. As an outsider, I will never understand the depth of feeling and concern that the Gwich'in bring to the Arctic Refuge fight, the relations of responsibility that they have maintained with the caribou since time immemorial. Shirley Frost, a citizen of the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation who toured with Lenny, explained to me that whenever she spoke about the refuge, she tried to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for young people, for future generations, for non-human beings. And what gave her strength, she said, was knowing that there were thousands of years of ancestors sitting behind me and speaking through me. She was addressing and inhabiting the present moment, but that moment contained multitudes of time, the countless generations behind her, the future generations before her, and the generations of caribou and other life forms that depend on Arctic ecosystems. All of these timescales were collapsed and compressed into her words and into the collective Gwich'in effort to maintain their pact with the caribou, to keep alive these relations that run the full sweep of Gwich'in time. As I pieced together the story of the last great wilderness, I found that it offered a portal into larger themes. While the slideshow provides the main narrative thread, the pages are populated with very different and diverse characters. I've woven in longer histories of indigenous resistance to colonial mega projects in Alaska and Canada, stories of college students and other activists who became protagonists in this history. And I track the changing political dynamics in Washington, D.C. I also highlight how Gwich'in leadership and advocacy built a coalition of conscience that widened support for the cause, encouraging religious organizations and others to fight for human rights. And I also look at other photographers and filmmakers and who use images as tools for public outreach, such as the documentary film Being Caribou and the photographs of Shubhankar Banerjee, who's first led me to this topic many years before. Shubhankar was like Lenny in certain ways. He was an unlikely activist. After the Smithsonian censored his captions and moved his Arctic Refuge show to a different part of the museum, he became a cause célèbre. He gained national media attention in a way that Lenny never did. But he soon became convinced that the best way to protect the refuge was to marshal the grassroots. And so for 2 years, he went on the road traveling with Gwich'in and Inupiat spokespeople, giving slideshows across the US. Like so many refuge defenders, he learned the power of grassroots visual culture and trickle-up politics. I deeply believed, he told me, that if you educate the public, it could have a real impact. And then he quickly added, it's exactly what Lenny Combe did for years and years and years. It's still the same story. And until 2017, this trickle-up approach worked. More than any other factor, citizen involvement made all the difference, encouraging fence-sitting politicians to cast their vote in favor of refuge protection. And what made this campaign so effective was the involvement of diverse groups. If the fight had remained narrowly focused on wilderness versus oil, it is almost certain that refuge defenders would have lost long ago. And then came the election of Donald Trump. The voices of ordinary people, the urgent need to protect wildlife habitats and Arctic ecosystems, the rights of Indigenous peoples, all were trampled over by the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which included a provision mandating oil and gas lease sales in the Arctic Refuge, which happened for the first time ever on January 6, 2021. At the exact same moment that insurrectionists stormed the U.S. Capitol, the Trump administration held this lease sale and auctioned off drilling rights to about 500,000 acres of the coastal plain. So with the refuge under ongoing threat, I think this history has a new urgency and relevance for our time. The stories that I've told here don't offer a blueprint to follow today. I think it's really hard to imagine someone loading up a car with slide projectors, but they indicate how a diverse movement has for decades been able to keep the Arctic Refuge from becoming another Prudhoe Bay, filled with sprawling spider webs of fossil fuel infrastructure. This book offers a history of contingency, a story of things that could have turned out differently. It's a history that was forged not only in the hard marble hallways of Capitol Hill or recorded in the pages of the New York Times, but a history that was made by a rambling activist, by Gwich'in spokespeople, by local organizers, by countless others. A history that was enacted in lecture halls, in church basements, and public libraries. It's a story that I've tried to tell as one of the grassroots versus Goliath, of unlikely cross-cultural alliances forming across vast distances. It's a history that I wrote during an urgent time, and I tried to infuse it with the hope that things might still turn out differently. Thank you all for your attention today, and I welcome your questions and feedback on this history.
Thank you, Finis. That was a great history, and it was very nice to see some of our old friends like Fran Maurer and Abe Thayer's images in your slideshow. So thanks for including those. Some of these old timers actually came out when we celebrated the anniversary of Arctic Refuge. So that was really fun. First question is, you did a nice job of reminding us how old some of us are. I remember dissolving slideshows. We had them here, but it also reminds us of the home movies that Olaus and Marty Murie made in 1956, A Letter from the Brooks Range. And it makes me wonder, slideshows, basically home movies, do you think social media today has diminished or increased the power of these individual presentations?
Yeah, I mean, I came of age, I went to college starting in 1989, to date myself here a bit, and I remember how important slideshows were. I was involved in campus environmental groups, and there were slideshows for rainforest and the Tongass Forest and other areas. I never actually saw Lenny give a presentation, even though we lived in the same state, which kind of baffled me for a long time. And I think that there is a sort of a thread throughout the book of this grassroots visual culture, beginning with the Muries, as you mentioned, and other examples through Anilka in the 70s and on. I think that social media has obviously a much greater capacity to reach, much larger numbers of people. And I think that when it's tied to specific actions, when it's not simply a question of raising awareness, but it is often tied to a campaign that's asking people to, sort of do something, not just in social media spaces, but elsewhere. I think it can have a really powerful impact that represents a kind of continuation of the media that I chart in this book. Just for one example of this is some of the videos produced by groups like 350.org in terms of the anti-Keystone pipeline fight, and other examples that were distributed through social media. It was a very sort of targeted audience they had in mind, but it always was, sort of connected with a sort of a set of actions that people could take. And so I think moving beyond simply awareness and information sharing, which I think has been a lot of the messaging or the emphasis in climate change communication, but to also find ways in which people can contribute in a variety of ways to actions. And I think Lenny did that very well with the slideshow. So good.
Cool. The questions are coming in. And Jim asks a rather broad one that I might try to narrow down a bit. He asks, how can we wean Alaska and the rest of the U.S. off of Alaska oil and the money generated from its sale? That might be a challenging question for a historian to answer. I don't know if you want to rework that a little, or the more manageable question related to your particular book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, both in terms of the history and the future, which I'm not going to claim any ability to be a prophet here, but absolutely the story of the ultimate approval of the leasing program in 2017. Was very much driven by Alaska politicians, including Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan. And it is because of the model of economic development in Alaska has been so tied to fossil fuel extraction. And so, like, beyond oil company interests, which at the moment is actually not all that great in the Arctic Refuge. Like, if this lease sale had been held 20 years ago, you can imagine all the big players would have been there to buy up the leases, but they didn't on January 6, 2021. It's a couple of small oil companies you've never heard of before from Australia, with I think operations elsewhere, and the state of Alaska bought up most of the leases. A state-owned corporation, Alaska did, and so that represents a big shift for a lot of reasons, including the role of activism in putting pressure on banks and corporations to make Arctic Refuge oil extraction seem like something that would put them in a bad light. It would not be good PR for them. So a lot of the emphasis from this is coming from this model of development in Alaska and what most of the leading politicians in the state, those at the national level, are pushing for. There is a movement going on within the state, however, to move away from that model. Much of it's led by various tribal governments and indigenous peoples in Alaska, along with environmental allies, to imagine Alaska not so wedded to this sort of finite model of economic development. So I do think there is a push coming from the grassroots within the state, often led by indigenous peoples, to have the state transition to something more sustainable for people and for the land. But it's a hugely important question.
It's a big one. First, a fun comment, then another question. Julie let us know she actually saw this slideshow in the public library in Fairbanks around 2000, and it had changed her life and had a huge impact. But we also have a number of viewers watching from a group out here at NCTC called Allies for Change. And I think they'd be interested in hearing what lessons you drew about this for conservationists to work most effectively with indigenous peoples. You touched on this a little at the end of the presentation, and you do in the conclusion of your book. What is the best way to effectively partner with indigenous peoples, like the story of the Gwich'in and Lenni and so on?
Yeah. I'll just say one quick comment about Julie's comment, just because in the book I was able to find through the research people who have stories much like hers, people who whose lives were changed by seeing the slideshow and sort of throwing themselves into this cause, and so it really had that kind of impact on many people. One of the the threads that run throughout the book that I think is important for this issue that you're asking about, Mark, is the way in which non-Indigenous people show up in communities and the way that they interact and the way that they form relations and build trust. And what's really interesting about somebody like Lenny, he didn't come there as an activist. He didn't come there with an agenda. In fact, the only agenda was to take photographs to sell for Audubon. And then Norma Cassie, whose photo he took, basically said to him, you can take my picture, but it's not going to do any good because you're going to be like everyone else. You're going to go to your community and you forget all about us. And her words really left a mark on him and made him think more about his purpose for being there, not just to be someone passing through in the short term, but someone who could build relations and could try to make a difference. And for him, so it became something that wasn't instrumental, it wasn't expedient, it wasn't extractive. And I think that's the same for some of the other characters that appear in the book, including somebody like Shubhankar Banerjee, who goes up years later, very, very different background from Lenny, but nevertheless didn't come up there as an activist and was willing to listen and to learn and not to try to move into the spotlight, not to become a spokesperson for Indigenous causes, but rather to help them in their own efforts to get their voices out and to share space in a more equitable way. And so I think that it may not be precise like lessons that I can sort of list out, but I think that in those stories and in those experiences and the ways in which trust was built in very real, like human to human relationships that weren't merely about furthering a political agenda or seeing someone as a mouthpiece for your own cause, but sort of respecting who they were and sort of what their interest was and what was bringing them concern and wanting to be involved, sort of to bring frontline communities to the forefront of the issue.
Great. One last question, Finis. I know you've written 2 previous books on imagery. And this book's about a photographer. So I have to ask you, and your PowerPoint was one of the prettiest and most visually eloquent presentations we've ever had. I have to ask you what you think the best imagery is to protect a place like Arctic Refuge. Is it images of caribou or polar bears? Is it images of people interacting there? You used to mix in your slideshow, and what your thoughts are on the imagery. There's something behind you. Looks like a Shubhankar Banerjee poster, perhaps, on your wall. What you think the most effective imagery is, perhaps, to conserve places like Arctic Refuge?
Yeah, so that's actually the photo that first sparked my interest in the Arctic all those years ago when I happened to randomly see it in Seattle. This actually kind of ties into something I should have added to the last question, which is that, in the book, I think that, and there's maybe a tendency to view this as, environmentalists providing a platform for Indigenous peoples. It's sort of like it's their power and agency that make that possible. And I think that there's some element of truth to that. But I hope that if someone were to read the book, they would also get the sense that sometimes it's actually Indigenous agency that's a lot more important. And it's, in fact, a history of Indigenous protection of lands, including on the Yukon side of the border and elsewhere, that allow certain people like Lenny Combe, like Shubhankar Banerjee, to have these epiphanies in their lands. It's that history of protection that made that possible. And so the question of agency, I hope, is one that someone would come out of maybe a more sort of nuanced understanding of how we can interpret that. But in terms of your question of images, I think that in all of these examples that I'm showing, it's never just the image alone. And so the controversy over Banerjee was not simply the photos, but the captions that were included in the original version of the Smithsonian show that were then cut, and the show was moved to the basement. And likewise with the slideshow having a narration and having Gwich'in voices, and in Shubhankar's case, Gwich'in and Inupiat voices accompanying him on these tours, so that the image is part of a multi-layered presentation that is not just reduced to the visual, that it's also the storytelling that's connected with it. But I think with the Arctic Refuge issue, I think all of these have their own power and impact, but I do believe that if the Gwich'in had not played such an important role, and if they had not shared their story with the world being Capitol Hill, but also all of these kind of grassroots venues around the U.S., that I honestly do believe that the Arctic Refuge drilling would have been approved a long time ago during other moments where the votes were incredibly close, and that it's hard in some ways not to imagine. It's all counterfactual, of course, which historians aren't supposed to do. But it's hard to imagine the Arctic Refuge not looking like Prudhoe Bay today had they not been so proactive and willing to share their stories and engage in leadership and advocacy on the issue. So as important as images are, I don't think images can ever be separated, siloed off from storytelling and the ways in which kind of a broader context of information can bring greater meaning to audiences.
Well, thank you, Finis. This was a wonderful presentation, a thoughtful spoken narrative, which we now know is critical to making the images work. And it's a wonderful book. It's very close to my heart as an environmental historian and a Fish and Wildlife Service employee. So thank you very much. We'd also like to thank our crack studio crew, and of course, thank all of you for tuning in and learning a little about our largest national wildlife refuge. And just a reminder, our next public lecture is going to be on April 13th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And Jack Davis is going to present on the bald eagle, the improbable journey of America's bird. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.